Tonight, we drift into a time when the world was vastly different, yet still remarkably similar in its struggles for freedom. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the Andes, the towering peaks of Ecuador, looming like silent sentinels over a land that was beginning to stir with discontent. Beneath the shadow of these mountains, the people of Ecuador were becoming more and more dissatisfied with the Spanish Empire's relentless control. The early 19th century wasn't just another chapter in the long story of colonization, it was the beginning of the end of Spanish rule in South America. Before we begin, if this little corner of calm has brought you any comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it feels genuine to you. No pressure. I'd also love to hear from you. Just drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always special to know we're all quietly gathered here from different corners of the world, like a family, scattered but still connected. Alright, now go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan or a soft hum in the background, something that feels like home. Nestle in, get cozy, and let's ease into tonight's story together. As we ease into the first moments of Ecuador's battle for freedom, let's pause and think for a moment. How does a country nestled between mighty mountains and bathed by the Pacific Ocean start to feel the stirrings of rebellion? It wasn't an overnight thing, you know. Ecuador, like so many other parts of Latin America, had been under Spanish rule for centuries, ever since the early 1500s. The Spanish crown's grip was tight. They ran the show with their viceroys in charge and their mines full of silver and gold that flowed back to Europe like lifeblood for the empire. But by the early 1800s, the colonies began to change. Revolutionary ideas were beginning to spread, carried on the winds of the French and American revolutions. And in Ecuador, people weren't just grumbling about their lot, they were starting to do something about it. Historians still argue whether the idea of independence was sparked by these external events, the American Revolution of 1776 and the French Revolution of 1789, or if Ecuador's local conditions were the real trigger. What's clear, though, is that the feeling of being ignored, even oppressed by the Spanish, was growing. It wasn't just about taxes or having to send riches across the ocean, it was about a people's identity. They were being told what to do, how to live, and who they could trade with. The irony is Ecuador wasn't just a remote backwater of the Spanish Empire. No, it had been an important part of Spain's colonial machine. The Viceroyalty of Quito, covering much of modern Ecuador, had been a key region for Spain. The Spanish knew Ecuador's resources, its gold and silver, its fertile lands, and they loved to exploit it. But in return, they didn't give much back. The elites in Quito and Guayaquil, the two cities that were the heart of colonial Ecuador, began to grumble. They wanted more influence, more autonomy, more freedom. At first, it was subtle. Groups of intellectuals, philosophers, and leaders began to hold clandestine meetings talking about the possibility of change. But it wasn't just the elite who wanted change. Every corner of Ecuador felt the weight of Spanish rule. And as the 1800s wore on, the spark of rebellion started to catch fire. And so Ecuador was slowly on its way to independence, though no one could have guessed that its path would soon intersect with the mighty Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. But that's a story for the next section. The stirrings of rebellion in Ecuador were far from unique to this small Andean nation. Across South America, the fires of revolution were starting to burn brighter. In Quito, the people's frustrations had been simmering for decades, and as the winds of change blew across the Atlantic, it became impossible to ignore. The French Revolution had provided the perfect blueprint for challenging an entrenched power, and Ecuador, with its increasing wealth from agriculture and mining, had the potential to be a pivotal player in the shift toward independence. But even though the spirit of revolution was beginning to take hold, it wasn't an easy path. The people of Quito were not just fighting against an external force, they were also up against deeply ingrained social hierarchies. The colonial elite in Ecuador had long enjoyed special privileges under the Spanish crown. They weren't necessarily eager to let go of the system that had enriched them, even if it meant breaking free from Spain. So while the push for independence was growing, it wasn't universally accepted. Historians still debate whether the first formal attempt at rebellion, the 1809 conspiracy in Quito, was the real beginning of Ecuador's fight for independence, or just a minor precursor. The conspiracy involved a mix of high society elites and some revolutionary-minded individuals, and though it was quickly crushed by the Spanish, it became a significant symbol. The failure of the 1809 uprising didn't stop the growing dissatisfaction, it only fueled it. Meanwhile, in the broader context of the Spanish Empire, the Napoleonic Wars were wreaking havoc. Napoleon's forces were marching through Europe, and in 1808 they even invaded Spain, forcing the king to abdicate. This created a power vacuum that left Spanish colonies in the Americas increasingly unstable. If Spain wasn't in control, could these colonies claim their own independence? The question was beginning to be asked, and the answer was becoming clearer: yes, they could. But as always, the question of who would lead the charge remained up in the air. And then, as if a missing piece of the puzzle fell into place, Simón Bolívar made his grand entrance into the region. Bolívar, the charismatic Venezuelan revolutionary, was already well known across South America as a military genius and a political visionary. His vision of a united Latin America, a Gran Colombia, was ambitious, sweeping, and idealistic. Bolívar's influence began to grow rapidly, and soon Ecuador would find itself swept into his vision for the future. Bolívar didn't just fight on the battlefield. His charisma and ideas resonated with leaders across South America, including in Quito. Yet Bolívar was not yet the man we know today, the liberator of South America. His dream of a united continent was still in its infancy, and his personal style, both as a military leader and a politician, was still being forged. For Ecuador, Bolívar represented both a promise and a challenge. Independence, yes, but at what cost? Bolívar's ideas were radical. How could they possibly apply to Ecuador's complex political and social situation? As Bolívar and his military forces began to build momentum across the continent, Ecuador found itself both caught up in this wave of change and also confronting its own internal tensions. The question remained: would Ecuador find its place in Bolívar's vision, or would it forge its own path toward freedom? Now, as the months drift by, the stage is set. Bolívar's name had become a rallying cry for independence, but his path was not a smooth one. Though he had already achieved military victories in Venezuela and Colombia, Ecuador was proving to be a different beast entirely. The landscape, both physical and political, was rugged and difficult, and the people of Ecuador had their own concerns, their own motivations for seeking freedom. Bolívar, ever the strategist, needed to carefully navigate these complexities if he was to turn his dream of a united South America into reality. But before Bolívar could step into Ecuador's tumultuous political scene, another revolutionary leader had made his mark: José de San Martín. San Martín, the Argentine general and fellow liberator, had his own vision for the continent, and for a brief moment he and Bolívar would find themselves in alignment. In fact, it was San Martín who had made a significant effort to free Peru and subsequently open the door for Ecuador's liberation. In 1821, San Martín led an invasion of Peru, successfully toppling the Spanish colonial forces there. But the task was far from complete. Ecuador, still firmly under Spanish control, was next in line. The two leaders, Bolívar and San Martín, held several key discussions about how best to approach the liberation of the region, and it was decided that Bolívar would take the reins in Ecuador. San Martín, for all his success in the south, understood the importance of Bolívar's influence in uniting the northern territories. Historians still debate whether this moment, the partnership of Bolívar and San Martín, was a strategic alliance of necessity or a genuine friendship born out of shared ideals. Their differing visions for the future of South America would eventually lead to friction, but in this moment they were united in their goal: freeing Ecuador from Spanish rule. Bolívar's first challenge upon entering Ecuador was not military, it was political. The people of Ecuador had witnessed the effects of colonial rule, yes, but they had also witnessed the economic and social power of the local elites. The political reality of Ecuador was complex, with different regions having varying levels of loyalty to the Spanish crown. Quito, for example, had a long history of rebellion against the Spanish, but Guayaquil, Ecuador's key port city, was much more cautious about overthrowing the established order. Bolívar needed to convince the local elites in Guayaquil that supporting his vision was in their best interest. He promised them autonomy within the larger vision of a united Gran Colombia, a promise that would later lead to significant friction. This is when Bolívar's talents as a negotiator became apparent. His charm and ability to navigate delicate political situations were just as crucial to his success as his military prowess. Bolívar could have easily marched into Ecuador with force, but he understood that the long-term success of independence would require more than just military victories. He needed local support, especially from the people who controlled the economy and resources. However, while Bolívar worked to gain support, a serious problem was brewing on the battlefield. Ecuador's terrain was notoriously difficult. Mountain passes, rugged roads, and unpredictable weather made any military campaign a logistical nightmare. But Bolívar's forces, though often undersupplied and overstretched, pushed forward, slowly gaining ground in the north. His forces faced stiff resistance from the Spanish, but with help from local militias, Bolívar's army kept up the momentum. By the time Bolívar reached Ecuador's borders in 1822, he was already a hero in the eyes of many. The people looked to him as a symbol of hope, a beacon for their desire to break free from the shackles of colonialism. His presence in Ecuador was about more than just military conquest. It was about a promise of liberty and self-determination. The inevitable clash between Bolívar's forces and the Spanish was coming. The stakes were high. Bolívar needed to win not just for Ecuador, but for the future of South America. Victory in Ecuador would open the door for full independence throughout the continent. Historians still argue whether Bolívar's success in Ecuador was due more to his military genius or to the regional forces that aligned with him. What's clear, however, is that without Bolívar's involvement, Ecuador's path to independence would have been much longer and far more complicated. As the revolutionary winds began to gust through Ecuador, a historic confrontation was on the horizon. As Bolívar's forces pressed into Ecuador, the tension was palpable. The region was not merely awaiting a military hero to swoop in and liberate them. No, it was a place divided not just by the mountains that cut through the landscape, but by competing factions within the country itself. Quito, with its revolutionary fervor, was eager for independence, while the more conservative coastal regions were wary of Bolívar's sweeping ideals. Yet in the heart of Ecuador, Bolívar was starting to gather support, building a coalition of local leaders and militias that would prove crucial in the coming battles. Ecuador's strategic importance to Bolívar's vision of Gran Colombia was clear. If Ecuador fell, the entire northern portion of South America might follow suit, and Bolívar's dream of a unified continent would take a significant leap forward. But this was no simple task. Ecuador's geography was unforgiving, and the entrenched Spanish forces were formidable. The road ahead would require not just military strength, but the very political savvy that Bolívar had honed over the years. In the summer of 1822, the scene was set for what would become a decisive moment in Ecuador's struggle for freedom, the Battle of Pichincha. The stage was nothing short of dramatic. Bolívar's forces, numbering about 2,000 men, were poised against the Spanish garrison entrenched at the foot of the Pichincha volcano just outside Quito. The volcano, a symbol of Ecuador's strength, seemed almost to echo the gravity of the moment, a volcano ready to erupt, mirroring the tension on the battlefield below. Bolívar's army, despite being smaller and undersupplied, was made up of a diverse mix of soldiers. These weren't just Venezuelan and Colombian troops. They were local fighters, Ecuadorians, who were ready to risk everything for their future. Bolívar knew that this battle would be pivotal not just for military reasons, but for the psychological effect it would have on the people of Ecuador. A victory would bolster their confidence, and perhaps more importantly, it would mark the beginning of the end of Spanish rule in the region. The battle, which took place on May 24, 1822, was a fierce one. Bolívar's forces had to scale the steep slopes of Pichincha under cover of darkness, making the assault that much more treacherous. They were facing not only Spanish soldiers, but also the harsh elements of the high-altitude Andes. As the sun rose over the battlefield, Bolívar's men were already engaged in the fray. The battle was won after several hours of intense fighting, with the Spanish forces eventually retreating, unable to withstand the combined might of Bolívar's army and the local militias. Historians still argue whether the victory at Pichincha was solely due to Bolívar's tactical genius or whether the local support was the decisive factor. Some believe that the people of Quito, eager for independence, provided a crucial boost to the morale of Bolívar's troops. Others argue that Bolívar's strategic planning and use of guerrilla tactics in the mountainous terrain were the real keys to success. Either way, the victory at Pichincha was a turning point. Ecuador's fate had been sealed, and with it, Bolívar's influence over the region would only grow. For Bolívar, however, this victory was both a triumph and a reminder of the difficult path ahead. The battle was just one piece of the puzzle. The real challenge lay in what would come next. Ecuador was now free from Spanish rule, but it was far from united. The political landscape remained fraught with tensions between those who favored a strong centralized government and those who pushed for regional autonomy. Bolívar's dream of a united Gran Colombia, encompassing Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, was still in its early stages, and his leadership would soon face increasing opposition from the very people he had liberated. Ecuador, now free, had to find its own way forward. Bolívar, having won the battle and secured the city of Quito, was hailed as a hero. But his role in the country was far from over. Though the Spanish were gone, the political struggles were just beginning. Would Ecuador remain part of Bolívar's vision for Gran Colombia, or would it seek its own independent path? Historians continue to debate the outcome of Bolívar's influence in Ecuador, but there's no question that his role in the country's independence was monumental. What Bolívar had started in the highlands of Ecuador would soon ripple out into the rest of South America, shaping the future of the continent for years to come. The victory at Pichincha had been a resounding success for Bolívar, but the aftermath was much more complicated than anyone could have anticipated. Ecuador was now free from Spanish control, but the country's path forward was anything but clear. While the battle itself had been a pivotal moment, it was merely a prelude to the intricate political maneuvering that would soon follow. Bolívar, ever the visionary, had planned for this moment, but what was not as clear was how he would keep the fledgling nations of South America united under his grand vision of Gran Colombia. You see, Bolívar's idea for a united Gran Colombia, comprising Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, was always an ambitious one, filled with the optimism of a continent eager for independence. Bolívar believed that if these nations could remain united, they would form a powerful bloc in the international world order. But in the wake of independence, the various regions were far more interested in their own local concerns than in any grand unity. The battle at Pichincha may have liberated Ecuador from the Spanish, but it did not guarantee long-lasting political stability. The immediate euphoria of independence quickly gave way to the painful reality of internal divisions. Ecuador was not a cohesive nation-state yet. It was a patchwork of various interests, regions, and ethnic groups that had only been loosely united under Spanish rule. The coastal region of Guayaquil, for instance, had a very different economy and culture from the highland cities like Quito. Bolívar understood that his dream of Gran Colombia would depend on overcoming these regional divisions, but he also knew that the way forward would be filled with challenges. Historians still debate the effectiveness of Bolívar's efforts to create a truly unified Gran Colombia. Many argue that Bolívar's vision was too idealistic for the realities of the region, while others maintain that his leadership was essential to the initial success of the independence movement. But what's clear is that the unity Bolívar sought was never truly realized. The Ecuadorians, despite their victory at Pichincha, were not all on board with Bolívar's vision of a grand federation. They had fought for freedom, but freedom often looks different when it's in your own backyard. And then there were the political factions. Ecuador's post-independence politics became increasingly fractured. Bolívar's efforts to implement a unified government were met with resistance from local leaders who, while initially supportive of independence, were now more interested in regional control. Guayaquil, with its strong merchant class and coastal economy, had a different set of priorities compared to the highland cities like Quito, where the struggle for independence had been most fervent. The local elites in both regions had their own power bases and were hesitant to relinquish control to a distant central authority. While Bolivar's leadership and military prowess were undeniable, his approach to governing centralized authoritarian and somewhat distant from local realities was at odds with the decentralized power structures that many Ecuadorians were used to. His vision of a strong, united Gran Colombia began to unravel as local leaders in Ecuador, like those in other parts of the new republic, began to push back against Bolivar's heavy-handed tactics. It wasn't just a clash of political ideologies. It was a matter of culture, of how people envisioned their nation and their role in it. In the face of growing resistance, Bolívar began to lose support within Ecuador, and the fractures within Gran Colombia deepened. The ideal of a unified federation seemed to be slipping further away as Ecuador and other nations within Gran Colombia began to chart their own paths toward political autonomy. Bolívar's dream of unity was starting to crumble under the weight of regionalism and political conflict. Yet, despite these challenges, Bolívar's impact on Ecuador's independence could not be denied. His military genius, his charisma, and his vision for a united Latin America had sparked the fires of revolution, and his presence in Ecuador had helped to secure the country's liberation from Spain. But the story of Ecuador's independence was far from over. As the country moved further from Spanish rule, it was left to navigate its own course, torn between Bolívar's grand ideals and the more pragmatic concerns of its people. Historians still argue whether Ecuador's struggle to find its place in the larger vision of Gran Colombia was an inevitable consequence of its diverse geography and political factions, or whether Bolívar's leadership style could have been adjusted to better accommodate the complexities of Ecuadorian society. What is undeniable, however, is that Ecuador's post-independence journey would be shaped by both the legacy of Bolívar and the reality of its own emerging national identity. As Bolívar's influence began to wane in Ecuador, the political landscape shifted dramatically. The promise of a united Gran Colombia, a beacon of freedom and shared purpose, was starting to show cracks. Bolívar, ever the bold leader, had always been the central figure in the independence movement. But as his health deteriorated and his political power faltered, the question of Ecuador's future became more pressing. Would it stay within the Gran Colombia Federation, or would it chart its own independent path? The cracks in Gran Colombia were not just political, they were deeply rooted in the very fabric of society. Ecuador, like many other newly liberated nations, was filled with individuals who had fought for freedom, but who were now struggling to find a stable and unified way to govern themselves. While Bolívar had played a crucial role in Ecuador's independence, his vision of a united South America was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. His vision was that of a strong, centralized government that could bind the diverse regions of Latin America together. But the reality on the ground was different. Each region of the newly independent nations, including Ecuador, had its own distinct culture, economy, and political interests. Bolívar's dream of a united continent clashed with the regionalism that had been ingrained in these countries for centuries. Historians still debate whether Bolívar's dream of Gran Colombia was simply too idealistic, or whether he could have done more to address the growing regional tensions. Some believe that Bolívar's top-down approach to governance, focused on centralization and consolidation of power, was too rigid for a continent as diverse as South America. Others argue that his vision was sound, but the time was simply not right for such unity. The tensions that emerged after Ecuador's independence, tensions that Bolívar could not manage, illustrated the challenges that faced the region. In Ecuador, local elites, many of whom had fought for independence alongside Bolívar's forces, were now looking at the idea of autonomy with increasing interest. They had fought to break free from Spain, but they weren't necessarily eager to place their future under the control of Bolívar's central government. Guayaquil, for instance, was a port city with a thriving commercial economy. The people of Guayaquil, many of whom had supported Bolívar during the struggle for independence, were now more concerned with protecting their economic interests than with participating in a broader regional federation. In Quito, the heart of Ecuador's revolutionary fervor, the situation was no different. Although Bolívar had been hailed as a hero, his centralized vision didn't sit well with many in the highlands who valued local control and independence. The desire for regional autonomy was growing, and it wasn't just a matter of economics or politics. It was about identity. Ecuadorians, both in the mountains and along the coast, were starting to see themselves as a distinct people, with unique needs and goals that didn't always align with Bolívar's grand plan. At the same time, Bolívar was facing increasing opposition in Colombia and Venezuela, the other key parts of Gran Colombia. The federations that he had worked so hard to build were beginning to crumble under the weight of political infighting, economic difficulties, and regionalist movements. Bolívar's dream was slipping through his fingers, and with it the vision of a united Latin America seemed to be fading. The dream of Gran Colombia was never fully realized, and the political instability in the region led to the eventual dissolution of the federation by 1831. Historians still argue whether Bolívar could have succeeded in uniting the countries of South America under Gran Colombia if he had taken a different approach. Some suggest that a more federalist system with greater autonomy for the individual nations might have been more successful. Others believe that Bolívar's focus on centralization and a strong national government was necessary, but simply came too early for the region to embrace it. Regardless of the debate, what's clear is that Ecuador, after its hard-won independence, was about to embark on a different journey, one that would take it away from Bolívar's grand vision and toward a path of greater political autonomy. Bolívar's declining health was a stark reminder that his time as the driving force behind South America's independence was coming to an end. In 1830, just as Gran Colombia was on the verge of collapse, Bolívar resigned from the presidency of Gran Colombia, a sign of the fragmentation of his vision. Ecuador, no longer tethered to Bolívar's ambitious ideals, began to explore its own identity. The country was still reeling from the effects of revolution, and the political instability that followed Bolívar's departure would shape Ecuador for years to come. Ecuador's leaders, faced with the reality of a fragmented continent, were forced to decide, should they continue to follow Bolívar's vision, or should they strike out on their own? In the years to come, Ecuador would chart its own course, but Bolívar's shadow would loom large over the country's early years of independence. Historians still wonder what might have been if Bolívar had lived longer, or if the idea of Gran Colombia had held together a bit longer. Could it have succeeded in creating a united South America, or was the fragmentation of the continent inevitable? Whatever the answer, one thing is certain: Bolívar's impact on Ecuador was profound. His role in the country's independence cannot be overstated, but the story of Ecuador's future was its own to write. The year 1830 marked a turning point not just for Bolívar, but for Ecuador too. After Bolívar's resignation and the disintegration of Gran Colombia, the question that loomed large was whether Ecuador would stay tethered to the collapsing federation or forge its own identity as an independent nation. The political landscape was in turmoil, and as Bolívar withdrew, the vacuum of leadership left Ecuadorians with conflicting visions of the future. Ecuador's decision to break away from Gran Colombia was not made lightly. The regional divides that had surfaced during the independence movement now became full-blown rifts. Quito, where Bolívar's influence had been strongest, still viewed him as a hero of independence, but his centralized vision was increasingly out of step with the political realities of the region. Guayaquil, on the other hand, had been more hesitant about joining Bolívar's project in the first place. With the collapse of Gran Colombia, the coastal city saw this as an opportunity to assert more control over its own affairs. Historians still argue about whether Ecuador's separation from Gran Colombia was an inevitable result of Bolívar's shortcomings, or if the rupture could have been avoided with a different approach to governance. Some believe that Bolívar's authoritarian leadership style, focused on centralizing power in his hands, was precisely what led to the country's fragmentation. Others suggest that the diverse interests and regional identities within the newly independent nations made it impossible for Gran Colombia to hold together regardless of Bolívar's political strategies. As Ecuador prepared to establish itself as an independent republic, the first major challenge was creating a stable government. The country was still recovering from the ravages of war, and the political fragmentation that had plagued Gran Colombia now threatened Ecuador's nascent political system. The lack of a strong unifying force led to frequent political upheavals, and the country's early years were marked by struggles between different factions. While Quito, the heart of Ecuador's independence movement, had a sense of revolutionary fervor, other regions like Guayaquil pushed for greater autonomy. It became clear that the country would need to find its own way to balance these competing interests. In 1830, Ecuador formally declared its independence from Gran Colombia and established itself as a republic. The first president of Ecuador, Juan José Flores, was a former general in Bolívar's army and had played a significant role in the liberation movement. His presidency marked the beginning of Ecuador's efforts to build a stable government, but it also highlighted the deep divides within the country. Flores was seen by some as a figurehead for Bolívar's ideals, but others viewed him as part of the old guard, a symbol of the power structures that had been challenged during the revolution. His presidency set the stage for ongoing political battles between factions that sought to define Ecuador's future. Bolívar's absence created a leadership vacuum in Ecuador, and the subsequent political instability would haunt the country for years. His vision for a unified South America, particularly his dream of Gran Colombia, had been abandoned, and with it, the hope of a united continent seemed to dissipate. Ecuador, like other former colonies, was left to navigate its own course, struggling to reconcile its revolutionary ideals with the practicalities of governing a newly independent nation. Yet even as Ecuador turned its back on Bolívar's vision, his legacy remained deeply ingrained in the country's psyche. The ideals of liberty, independence, and republicanism that Bolívar had championed continued to resonate even as the political structures he had envisioned fell apart. Ecuadorians would continue to look to Bolívar as a symbol of their fight for independence, even if his dream of a united South America was no longer a viable path forward. For Bolívar, the fall of Gran Colombia and the disintegration of his vision was a bitter defeat, but it also served as a testament to the difficulty of forging unity in a region as diverse and fractured as South America. Historians often reflect on Bolívar's final years and wonder if he could have done more to sustain Gran Colombia, or if its collapse was an inevitable consequence of the region's complexities. Could Bolívar have created a lasting unity, or were the divisions too deep to overcome? The answer remains elusive, but what is clear is that Bolívar's influence in Ecuador and in South America, more broadly, shaped the course of the continent's history in profound ways. Ecuador, now firmly separated from Gran Colombia, found itself at a crossroads. The country had won its independence, but the next challenge was constructing a nation that could function without the guiding hand of Bolívar. As political fragmentation increased, a clear division began to emerge between the coast and the highlands, both geographically and politically. In many ways, Ecuador's struggle for unity after independence mirrored the broader difficulties faced by South America as a whole, attempting to balance regional autonomy with the need for a strong central government. The early years of the Republic were marked by instability. After the initial euphoria of independence, the country was plunged into a series of internal conflicts and power struggles. Local elites, many of whom had supported the independence movement, now sought to preserve their own power and influence. In Quito, the highland elite viewed themselves as the true heirs to the independence movement and pushed for a centralized government. Meanwhile, in Guayaquil, the merchant class, with its economic interests tied to trade, advocated for a more decentralized system that would allow the coastal regions to retain greater control over their resources. Historians still debate whether the tensions between Quito and Guayaquil could have been resolved without violence, or whether they were an inevitable result of the differing priorities of the two regions. Some argue that a more federal approach to governance, allowing for greater autonomy for each region, might have led to a more stable country in the long run. Others believed that the sheer diversity of the country's regions made a unified national government the only viable option. Regardless, the result was a series of political and military conflicts that hindered Ecuador's development. Despite these struggles, the idea of Bolívar's dream continued to linger in the background. Bolívar's political ideals, though unfulfilled in the form of Gran Colombia, had planted the seeds for many of the democratic principles that would later shape Ecuador's government. His belief in liberty and republicanism had left a lasting impact on the region, even if his vision for a united South America had failed. Ecuador's leaders, although divided in their approach, were still committed to building a republic that embodied the ideals of independence and freedom. The influence of Bolívar's legacy extended beyond politics. Bolívar had in many ways shaped the cultural identity of many Latin American countries, including Ecuador. His image as the liberator became ingrained in the national consciousness, even as his political vision for the region fell apart. Statues of Bolívar were erected streets named in his honor, and his memory became a cornerstone of Ecuador's national identity, despite the fractures within the political system. Yet as the years passed, Bolívar's shadow began to fade from Ecuadorian politics. The country's ongoing political instability meant that the focus shifted away from Bolívar's grand vision and toward more practical concerns such as building a stable government, managing regional tensions, and securing Ecuador's place in the world. Despite this, Bolívar's role in Ecuador's independence remained a critical chapter in the country's history, one that would be revisited time and again as the nation sought to understand its place in the broader struggle for Latin American unity. Historians continue to grapple with the complexities of Bolívar's legacy in Ecuador. Did his vision for a united South America exemplified by Gran Colombia have any chance of success, or was his failure an inevitable result of the region's deeply rooted divisions? Could Ecuador and South America as a whole have been united under Bolívar's leadership, or was the continent doomed to a future of fragmented nations, each grappling with its own set of political, economic, and social challenges? These questions remain unanswered, but what is certain is that Bolívar's influence on Ecuador and on South America as a whole was profound, and his story will forever be intertwined with the region's quest for independence and unity. As Ecuador moved forward, it would eventually begin to carve out its own path separate from the grand vision of Bolívar. However, the foundations of independence that Bolívar helped lay his ideals of liberty, freedom, and republicanism remained central to the identity of the young nation. Ecuador, like so many of its neighbors, had to reconcile its revolutionary aspirations with the complexities of governance. In doing so, it would continue to honor Bolívar's role in its struggle for independence, even as it sought to define its own future. As Ecuador ventured further into its post-independence era, it faced the daunting task of transforming from a fractured region into a cohesive and functioning nation-state. The legacy of Bolívar, though revered, had proven both a source of inspiration and a symbol of what could not be achieved. Bolívar's dream of a united South America, a grand federation stretching from the Caribbean coast to the Andes, was fading, and the geopolitical landscape of Latin America was evolving in a direction he had not foreseen. Ecuador's political identity at this point was still deeply influenced by Bolívar's ideals, but the practical realities of governing a diverse, newly independent nation were now front and center. The early years of Ecuador's independence were characterized by constant political unrest. In the wake of Bolívar's withdrawal from the region and the collapse of Gran Colombia, Ecuador was left with a delicate political balance to maintain. The country was not yet a fully unified republic, and the fragile union between the highland regions and the coastal areas was strained. The political landscape was filled with competing factions, each vying for control, and the central government was unable to effectively impose its authority on the entire nation. Ecuador's leaders, many of whom had been part of the independence movement, were deeply divided on how the country should be governed. Some believed in Bolívar's vision of a centralized government with a strong national leadership, while others pushed for a more federal system that would grant the regions more autonomy. These ideological divides created a situation where it seemed like Ecuador's identity was being formed in real time, an identity that was both shaped by the ideals of Bolívar's revolution and by the practical need to create a functional government. At the heart of this struggle was the tension between the highland cities like Quito and the coastal city of Guayaquil. Quito, having been the epicenter of the independence movement in Ecuador, was deeply committed to the notion of a unified republic. The elite in Quito, however, often clashed with the coastal merchants and landowners of Guayaquil, who had a more independent streak and wanted greater control over their economic resources. This conflict would persist for decades, with the two cities often finding themselves on opposite sides of Ecuador's political struggles. Historians continue to debate whether Ecuador's instability in the early years of independence could have been avoided. Was it inevitable that the country's political system would be torn apart by regionalism, or could Bolívar's vision of unity have been sustained in some form? Some argue that the deep social and economic divides between the highlands and the coast were too significant for a centralized government to succeed. Others believe that a stronger leadership, whether from Bolívar or a successor, might have been able to heal the rifts and create a more unified nation. The reality of Ecuador's situation, however, was that the country had no choice but to navigate the growing divide between centralized governance and regional autonomy. This struggle would dominate Ecuador's political life for much of the 19th century. The influence of Bolívar's ideals, particularly his emphasis on liberty, republicanism, and the importance of unity, remained a guiding force. Yet as the country's political landscape shifted, these ideals would often clash with the practical realities of governance, leading to a series of failed attempts at achieving political stability. Meanwhile, as Ecuador tried to forge its path, Bolívar's legacy continued to be a source of both pride and frustration. His vision of Gran Colombia, a united federation of independent republics, may have been a failure in the strictest sense, but it had provided the initial spark for the independence movements across South America. His role in Ecuador's independence was undeniable. Without Bolívar's leadership and military genius, Ecuador's path to freedom would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. Yet the nation was now faced with the challenge of defining its future without the grand vision that Bolívar had once offered. Bolívar's influence over Ecuador's national identity would persist, but the reality of Ecuador's political struggles in the years that followed was more complicated. The nation's independence had been won, but the fight for national cohesion, balancing unity with regional autonomy, had only just begun. As the years passed and Ecuador moved deeper into the 19th century, its struggle to define its own identity without Bolívar's guidance became ever more apparent. Though the country had won its independence and had been liberated from Spanish rule, it was clear that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. The dream of a united South America, one that Bolívar had fought so passionately to achieve, seemed increasingly out of reach. Yet his influence on Ecuador and on the broader Latin American independence movement remained undeniable even as the country carved out its own path. In Ecuador, as in many newly independent nations, the question of national unity was still unresolved. The idea of Gran Colombia, a unified federation that Bolívar had envisioned, had fallen apart under the weight of regionalism, economic struggles, and political infighting. Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, once united under Bolívar's banner, now found themselves divided into separate entities, each struggling to find its own political footing. Ecuador, in particular, was divided between the highland region around Quito, which had been the heart of the independence movement, and the coastal region of Guayaquil, which had more commercial interests and a different vision for the country's future. Despite the political turmoil, Bolívar's influence remained a constant thread throughout Ecuador's history. His role in the country's fight for independence was undeniable, and his ideals of liberty and republicanism continued to shape the political discourse. Yet as the nation grappled with the complexities of governance, it became clear that the vision of a united South America that Bolívar had championed would not be realized. Historians continue to debate Bolívar's legacy in Ecuador and throughout South America. Some argue that his vision of unity was simply too idealistic for a region so diverse and divided. Others maintain that his ideals were sound, but the time was not yet right for the kind of federation he had imagined. What is certain, however, is that Bolívar's leadership was instrumental in the success of the independence movements throughout Latin America, and his influence continued to shape the continent long after his death. As Ecuador settled into its newfound independence, it began to move away from Bolívar's grand vision of unity. The country, like many others in South America, would spend the next century grappling with the complexities of nation-building, struggling to reconcile its revolutionary ideals with the challenges of political and social stability. Despite this, Bolivar's memory would remain a central part of Ecuador's national identity, and his legacy would continue to inspire those who sought to create a more just and equitable society. In the end, Ecuador's independence from Spain and its eventual break from Gran Colombia marked a new chapter in the country's history. Bolivar's dream of a united South America may have faltered, but the spirit of revolution and the ideals of liberty that he had championed lived on in Ecuador's quest for self-determination. While the path to political stability and national unity was a rocky one, Ecuador's independence set the stage for the country to carve out its own place in the world, independent from the shadows of its colonial past and the fading vision of Bolivar's Grand Federation. As we close tonight's story, remember that while Bolivar's vision of a united Latin America may have faltered, his role in shaping the continent's struggle for independence remains a defining moment in history. Ecuador, like many of its neighbors, faced its own unique challenges in the wake of independence, but the echoes of Bolivar's ideals, freedom, unity, and liberty, would continue to reverberate through the years, guiding the nation as it forged its own future.